The Battle of Murfreesboro, or Stone's River, would always remain one of the bitterest memories for the Kentuckians. In the terrible days of fighting, they took fearful losses, especially on January 2nd, 1863, when Bragg sent Breckinridge's command into an ill-advised charge that saw Hanson mortally wounded and hundreds of the brigade killed or wounded. So devastated was the brigade that a distraught Breckinridge wept before them and called them "my poor orphans," using, for perhaps the first time, the name by which they are now most remembered. For years afterward an antipathy existed between them and Bragg, who spent the next several months feuding with Breckinridge. Recovered from his Baton Rouge wound, Helm, now a brigadier, reassumed command from the slain Hanson, and the brigade went into the best winter quarters it enjoyed during the war, passing its time with theatricals and balls and drill competitions. Then, on May 24th, they were sent off to Vicksburg again, this time to try to avert the river city's capture by Ulysses S. Grant. They did not reach Vicksburg in time, and after its surrender, they withdrew to Jackson, Mississippi, as part of an army led by General Joseph E. Johnston. There they tried unsuccessfully to hold the city against William T. Sherman. Forced to withdraw, they moved into the interior to Camp Hurricane for another miserable Deep South summer. John Jackman was a soldier who served with the 9th Kentucky Infantry in the Confederate Army. This is his journal, Murfreesboro Camp Life. Now commenced a long siege of monotonous camp life. However, I was kept busy writing all the time, and did not have an opportunity of watching how the heavy hours went by. The boys, too, were kept pretty busy drilling and standing guard. Colonel Roger Hanson, soon after promoted to brigadier general, now took command of the brigade and had everything done up in military order. He was the best disciplinarian we ever had. The brigade was all under the same guard line, and at dress parade the whole brigade would be in perfect line of battle on the color line. Guard duty had to be done to the letter. Old Roger, as we called the general, most of his own regiment called him Flintlock, was going the rounds at all hours of the night to see that all was well. The boys had many adventures with him. We lived well all the time we were encamped at Murfreesboro. Good rations were issued to us, and we always could buy butter, chickens, eggs, turkeys, sweet potatoes, apples, etc., from the country people at the old rates, paying Confederate. November 4th, brigade marched with 3 days' rations in haversacks towards Nashville. The camp was left standing. I was left behind, making monthly returns and so on. Colonel Hunt, having requested me to sleep in his tent at night, I did so, sleeping magnificently in the colonel's feather bed. The brigade returned to camp the next day, or the day after, I have forgotten which. The movement was a feint on Nashville, going within 5 miles of the city. Morgan came into Edgefield opposite the city at the same time, December 5th. Early the brigade fell in, equipped for a campaign, and marched away, leaving the camp standing. I was left behind again. A heavy snowstorm was passing, and soon the gray column was lost to view in the whirling snow. The brigade marched 18 miles and bivouacked at Beard's Mills. Here, the next day, 6th, at 2 p.m., a force was organized for the expedition to Hartsville, composed of the 9th and 2nd Kentucky Infantry under Colonel Hunt and 2 of Morgan's regiments of cavalry. The whole force was commanded by Morgan. A section of Cobb's battery was also along. The expedition got to the Cumberland River 25 miles by midnight, and the infantry immediately commenced crossing over in an old, leaky ferry flat, which had to be kept afloat by constant bailing. The cavalry, and I believe the artillery, forded the river. December 7th. By daylight, all were over, and the column pushed on to the camps, yet 5 miles off. The enemy was attacked at sunrise, and an engagement of 3/4 of an hour caused him to surrender his whole force, 2,000 strong. By noon the Confederates were back across the river, the rear being shelled some by the Federal reinforcements coming up, and by 9 p.m. were back at Beard's Mills with the balance of the brigade. On the evening of the 8th, all returned to camp well loaded down with booty. Had 3 stands of colors. The prisoners were left in town. December 13th. Jeff, reviewing the troops, first reviewed our brigade and was well pleased with the orphans. They conducted themselves every inch the soldier. They passed in review, marching perfectly. Hanson was made brigadier general on the spot. First time I ever saw old Jeff. From that time, nothing of interest going on. I was kept pretty busy all the time, making reports and recording orders, a large number coming in daily. December 28th. This morning the brigade moved out on Stone River. The camp is left standing. Adjutant Curd ordered me to stay with the office. He seems to have a presentiment something is going to happen to him. Left word with me for Major Wycliffe, who is away on special duty. A beautiful, sunny day, and a stream of glittering bayonets has been pouring through town all day long, troops marching out to their respective positions in the line of battle. In the evening, a detail came from the regiment and struck tents, loaded the wagons. While thus occupied, Colonel Hanson came into camp, having started away the evening before on a leave of absence, but had now come back to participate in the battle. Feeling like I would have some adventure, as well as the other boys, I asked the colonel to let me go with the regiment. He seldom refuses a fellow the privilege of trying his hand in a fight, and told me to come out after seeing that everything was packed away in the wagon properly. One of our company had been left in camp, too sick to walk, and after dark went to the college hospital to get him admitted, which I did after a good deal of talk, came back and sent him away on horseback. The wagon train moved out on the Manchester Pike about 9 p.m., looked desolate enough about the old camp. The numbers of brick chimneys left standing alone made it appear a city had been destroyed on the spot. Billy Ambrose, who was sick and going out with me, and I concluded to stay there until morning. We tried to sleep, but without much success, as the wagon trains were rumbling and roaring over the pike all night, the teamsters popping their whips and yelling. December 29th. When morning came, we got up, shook off the drowsiness, ate our breakfast, then started for the regiment, lying in line of battle. The morning was beautiful, being the commencement of one of those lovely Indian summer days which sometimes come even in the winter season down south. Though the day was beautiful, a storm was brewing. The deep resonance of cannon came rolling over the hills from towards Nashville, and we could sniff saltpeter in the air. 2 miles from town came up with the regiment, the boys lying lazily about on a rocky hill, waiting for the coming of events. A wagon came out with rations and cooking utensils, and we cooked rations. The thunder of cannon kept coming nearer. As the gloom of evening set in, a large brick mansion, Cowan's house, across the river from us and in front of Withers' division, was set on fire to be burned out of the way, and high up leaped the flames, mingled with an inky column of smoke which pierced the very heavens. Gloomy sight at such a time as this. Soon after, our cavalry, which had been falling back in front of the Federal Army, burst out of the cedars in front of Withers, and also came dashing back from our side of the river. We immediately fell in, and advanced in line of battle over a rocky ravine and through an old field, where the weeds were up to our shoulders, and so thick we could hardly march. The evening was warm, and I had a heavy overcoat on, which with tugging through the weeds caused me to nearly suffocate. I pulled it off once with the intention of abandoning it, but again picked it up and buckled it under my belt. Well, I did so, for afterward it came in good place. We halted and sent forward Company D as skirmishers. They moved forward to a cornfield and were soon engaged, Lieutenant Beale in command, being wounded, the field named being on a hill, which, if taken possession of by the enemy, would have been disastrous to us, for it was the key to our position. I don't know why we were not ordered to take position on this hill in the beginning. We moved forward to support our skirmishers and lay down just under the crest of the hill. Cobb's battery was placed in position on top. Darkness had now come on. The enemy advanced and drove our skirmishers in. They fired pretty briskly for a time, making the cornstalks rattle about us. In the darkness, the Federal skirmish line came right up among the battery, which was being unlimbered a little in advance of us. One of the Feds hallooed out, "Boys, here is a cannon, let us get away from here," and they all skedaddled. Two of our regiments then advanced, and the Federal force, whatever it was, withdrew over the river. A strong skirmish line was then established on the margin of the rivers, and the brigade fell back into the old weed fields, where they slept on their arms. I went back to the rocky hill to stay by a fire. About midnight a rain set in, and I adjourned to a neighboring corn crib and slept in the shucks. December 30th. A murky morning, misting rain, started for the regiment and found it had moved. I then went back to where Billy Ambrose was having some coffee made by his boy. Billy was not able to be with the regiment, but was on the field. Stayed with him until the afternoon, when I went to the regiment, the enemy shelling our lines during the day. Our army kept quiet. We did see a little fighting in front of Withers. We had a tent fly, which we put up temporarily to shield us from the rain. Sometimes the shells would make us seek shelter behind a big rock. In the afternoon, the rain having slacked up, I sought out the regiment, which I found lying about in a cedar thicket, grumbling at the weather. Sometimes, too, shells would come tearing through the cedars, making a fellow feel uncomfortable. At last, night came on, and we moved back into the ravine in the rear of the line, near where I found them on first coming out, and near where Billy and I had been all day. Here the boys had fires. Rain ceased at dark. I slept with Billy Ambrose under our fly. December 31st. The sun came up clear. The regiment had moved off before I woke up, had breakfast. The ambulances and caissons are sheltered in our ravine. Just as the sun was coming up, I heard a yelling over towards Withers's division and ran up on the hill to see the cause. That division was charging across a big field in perfect line of battle, the men yelling and cheering. Soon the Federal batteries opened on them, then the musketry, and I could see his men falling. Presently they opened fire, and the line was obscured in smoke. This was, I believe, the grandest scene I ever witnessed in the military line. I stood a moment watching the battle, and a stray shell came near cutting me down. Thinking the ball had now opened in earnest, I buckled on my armor and started for the regiment. One of the boys was with me. We had to pass over a long field in the rear of a battery, which was then being subject to heavy fire. First, a shell would tear up the ground in front of us. Then we would go a little slow. Then a ball would plow up the ground in the rear of us. Then we would quicken our pace. When we got to the regiment, it was falling in to march out in rear of the battery, which was composed of 12 guns, and on the hill where we skirmished the first evening, as soon as the regiment got to the proper place, a short distance from the guns, ordered to lie down. Our battery, or batteries, for there were 3 parked together, opened fire on the advancing columns, and the Federal guns replied, firing over the heads of their troops. I believe there were 38 cannon playing on us at once. The hill protected us a little, yet I saw, from my position on the extreme left of the regiment, numbers of cannonballs strike just in front of the line and skip over. We were not behind the battery more than 5 minutes, for seeing the numbers that were being hurt, General Hanson had the regiment moved off a little to the right, out of range. In this, we lost about 20 or 30 wounded, but luckily no one was killed. We did not move again during the day. Our company went to get in the trenches by the guns in the evening, but the order was countermanded and it came back. Just before sundown, a cannonball passed through Adjutant Curd, killing him instantly. I had just left his side, having been to him to get some tobacco. The day was cool, though the sun shone out all the time. Cold wind from the north. Lying on the cold ground a good deal during the day, was chilled, and when darkness put a stop to the stirring scenes, I went back to the ambulance station to get by the fire. Dr. Byrne gave me a drink, and we spread down blankets together, slept well. January 1st, 1863, all quiet today. Both armies seem to be taking a blowing spell after the hard fighting yesterday. Turned my gun over to one of the infirmary corps, they having to take arms. January 2nd, raining in the morning. Back at the ambulance train nearly all the time. All quiet until about 3 p.m., when Bragg ordered Breckinridge's division to charge over Stone River at Rosecrans's army. All the brigade went into the charge, save our regiment, which was left to support the batteries and hold the hill heretofore mentioned. The rain stopped just before the charge was made. Hanson killed. January 3rd, rain pouring down all day long, at the regiment part of the time, helping dig in the entrenchment. Late in the evening, having got wind that the army was going to fall back that night, I went into town to see my brother William at Dr. Scott's. Soon after getting in town, the rain came down in torrents and continued all night long. Went to the medical purveyor's office, and there found my brother William, Dr. Scott, and Dr. Pendleton, medical director of the division. They had been on the field and had gotten things nice to eat, and still had some on hand. Not having eaten anything but dough for a week, I enjoyed a good supper. Wrote home, giving the letter to Dr. Pendleton to mail, as he was to be left with the wounded. Troops marching back through town all night. Slept with my brother William before a huge fire in the office. January 4th, up before daylight. The doctor having a spare horse, I was to ride. We mounted just at daylight and rode off through a pelting rain. All had left before the dawn. We overtook our regiment 5 miles from town on the Manchester Pike, acting as rear guard. Being mounted, Colonel Hanson sent me ahead to turn back an ordnance wagon. The road was a perfect loblolly, and in riding by the infantry, sometimes I would splatter mud on them, and often expected to be bayoneted. In the after part of the day, the sun came out hot. Evening came up with the wagon train, camped near Manchester. Not having been on horseback for so long, this ride of 30 miles tired me almost as much as if I had walked. January 5th. The wagon train started on for Tullahoma, got 5 or 6 miles on the road, and ordered back to Manchester, where arrived after dark, raining after night. Slept with my brother William on a pile of hospital comforts, which caught fire and could hardly be put out. January 6th. In the morning the regiment came up. The train being again ordered towards Tullahoma, I kept with it on my horse. When we got as far as we did before, the wagons of our regiment were ordered back to Manchester. Being on horseback, I didn't care much for these notionate movements. Just after dark, we found the regiment in camp near town, I dismounted and resigned my steed to the doctor. That night my mess did not put up the tent. We slept on it. Late at night I woke up with something heavy on my face. I found it to be an old gander, quietly roosting on my head, which some of the boys had brought into camp. I presume he saw that I had no feathers under my head and concluded to put some on top instead of underneath. I thanked him by flinging him against a stump hard by. Now commences another long siege of inaction. Nothing much to vary one day from another, a routine of camp duty from one week's end to another. I made no entries in my journal during the time we encamped at Manchester. From January 6th to April 23rd, Manchester, the county town of Coffee, is a small place on the branch railroad running to McMinnville. At the time we sojourned in its vicinity, the town was very much torn up, both armies having had a turn at the place. The boys, however, found enough society to keep up amusement, and all the winter were flirting with the young ladies. Balls were frequent. I attended two, one at a hotel in town, the other at an unfinished paper mill below town on Duck River. When the latter came off, a rain poured down all night, so no one could go home. At this ball, Augustus Moore and company played Bombastis, Furioso, a stage having been arranged for the purpose. The boys would defray all expenses in getting refreshments, etc. When they would go out to invite the girls, the old dames would be informed an abundance of pure coffee would be on hand, which all objections to their girls going to the ball would cease. You may look for me and my gals to be there, sure. The boys knew the proper chord to touch, to bring the gals. The gals would dance, and the old ladies would sip coffee. The brigade, soon after coming to Manchester, was placed under the command of Brigadier General Benjamin Hardin Helm, Vice Brigadier General Roger W. Hanson, killed at Murfreesboro. The boys had a good deal of drilling to do. The brigade at different times was drilled and reviewed in the presence of General Breckinridge, General Hardee, and General Joseph E. Johnston. They all pronounced them the best drilled troops in the army. Our regiment was stationed alone for several weeks at Manchester before the balance of the brigade came up from Tullahoma. The boys conducted themselves in such a manner that they won the esteem of the people. They thought the 9th Kentucky was the best regiment in the army. When the other regiments came up, a great many depredations were committed, that is, hogs killed and so on, but none of the people laid any blame on the 9th. If our boys ever did do such things, which is highly probable, all went to the credit of the other regiments. There was church every night in town. For several weeks before we marched, chaplains generally officiating. A night or two before we moved from Manchester, the brigade marched towards McMinnville to apprehend a cavalry raid. The rain was hitting down, and the night as dark as Erebus. Saw nothing of the enemy. I was not along. This concludes the 6th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more stories and leave a comment.